Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
Ready?
Yep. Let's go. Let's laugh. We are imperfect after all.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to the Imperfect Us podcast.
I'm Leanne Camilleri.
And I'm Lisa Downs. As hosts of the Imperfect Us podcast, we share relatable stories that celebrate we are all perfectly imperfect humans, leading perfectly imperfect lives. We discover practical and evidence-based strategies that draw on the science of wellbeing and positive psychology that help us to uncover the barriers that might hold us back from being our authentic selves and turn them into opportunities so that we can show up more consistently, doing what we really aspire to do and who we want to be.
We acknowledge the Wadawurrung and the Kaurna people as traditional custodians of the beautiful lands on which this podcast is being recorded. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to other First Nations people who are here with us today. So, let's get started.
Today we are speaking with Linda Rowley. Linda is a wellbeing facilitator and coach working with individuals and workplaces to create shared wellbeing goals. Linda has a professional interest in grief and loss, particularly ambiguous loss and how it impacts our lives. In her practice, Linda draws on current research on ambiguous loss, positive psychology, and wellbeing science, coupled with her own lived experience. Welcome, Linda. Linda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Leanne and Lisa. It's wonderful to be here.
We are so excited to be talking to you today, and we're really curious to understand, what is ambiguous loss?
Great question. I think ambiguous loss is something that is probably a familiar feeling or experience for most of us, and yet many of us probably just don't have the words around how we might talk about it. So the term ambiguous loss was actually coined by the researcher Dr. Pauline Boss back in the late 1970s. So it's been around a while, but it's not necessarily a common term that we hear. So it refers to that kind of deep sense of sadness or loss that we sometimes feel, but it's not related to the death of a loved one. So with ambiguous loss, the loss that we experience is often kind of unclear and ambiguous. So there's two types of ambiguous loss. For one type, it can involve a loss of emotional closeness to someone, even when they remain with us physically. So a common example of that would be someone who has perhaps experienced dementia or an acquired brain injury, might be someone that has a substance use problem, or somebody even that just works compulsively. So they're still with us physically, but that sense of emotional attachment that we had, or that sense of psychological connection, has changed. There's something about it that has been ruptured or fractured, and it's not the same as it used to be. Even someone perhaps who experiences a severe mental illness like depression, you can see how they wouldn't be there in the same way for their partner, for instance, or that sense of connection just wouldn't be the same. Mm-hmm. So that's the first type of ambiguous loss. The second type of ambiguous loss is when someone is no longer with us physically, but we still hold them in our hearts and minds. So that might include when someone immigrates, they might take up a posting overseas, for instance. And so they're no longer with us physically, but we still think about them a lot, right? And we still, have feelings towards them. It could be when somebody's adopted out, a similar thing could happen, or when a relationship breaks down. So partners separate, people get divorced. So we still hold that person with us emotionally. We still feel an emotional tie to the person, even though they're no longer in the same physical space with us. So they're the two types of ambiguous loss. And often one of the kind of main features with ambiguous loss is that the loss is often unacknowledged and unresolved. So in a workplace, an example might be if you have a mentor who works in the same office as you, and then they move to, headquarters interstate, there's that loss of that closeness of the relationship that you've had with them. Or if you work for a workplace that merges with another workplace, you've had a very close relationship with your boss or the person you report to, and then all of a sudden they have a whole new team, right, that has to report to them. So even though they're still in the same office, their availability is no longer what it once was. And so you've kind of lost that sense of closeness there. So I think the important thing here is that ambiguous loss is a normal, typical response to changes in our lives. And they can be, fairly minor changes like the workplace examples that I've just given, or they can be really big, life changes for us. If a loved one is diagnosed with dementia, for instance, or mental illness. And of course, we all react differently. So we can't make assumptions or second guess how people will react to changes in their life. But some of us do react with that sense of loss.
That's so fascinating to me in particular. I was thinking about the loss, or when you mentioned about, moving out of your country and so forth, and that being emotionally connected still to people, but physically not having them there. And it just reminded me of when my boys, both of them actually moved out of our state. And I just remember the feelings, the emotional feelings and connections that I had was so great in that, I just hoped that everything was going to go well and that we've given them all of those things. But I had this definite pit of sadness but joy at the same time. And I wonder if that was that ambiguous loss actually happening at that time.
Absolutely, Lisa. And that's one of the features of ambiguous loss, is having those ambivalent feelings, right? So, and even when we are the ones that make a decision to move, right? Even though we've made the decision, so we've had agency around that, it's, been our choice, we still can feel a sense of ambiguous loss around that as well. So normalising the ambivalence that goes with experiencing ambiguous loss is actually one of the 6 guidelines that have been developed by Pauline Boss to help to live well or live better with ambiguous loss, because ambiguous loss defies closure. So not that I like the term closure when it comes to the death of a loved one either, because, and look, Pauline Boss says this as well. She says, closure is great if you're buying a house, right? But not so great when we talk about relationships, because it's not like we can just close the door on relationships. So, but I think there's a certainty, there's a finality when someone dies, as difficult as it is, right? So I'm by no means minimising the grief and bereavement process when someone dies, not at all. With ambiguous loss, though, one of the things that we continue to struggle with is that lack of clarity around the relationship and that uncertainty that can sometimes be lifelong for us. So one of the keys to living well with ambiguous loss is how we manage that sense of uncertainty over a period of time, and the ambivalent feelings that we feel with the situation. We might feel a sense of excitement and joy, and at the same time that kind of nervousness and fear and that real sadness for what we're missing out on.
I hear what you're saying there. It's a day for reflecting on ourselves, isn't it? Sorry, Linda. But I cared for someone with Alzheimer's. I remember that in the days after she passed away, there was a mixture of feelings of relief for her and myself and my family, but also a deep sadness that she was no longer here. And I'm wondering if this is ambiguous loss in that it's not, I'm struggling to describe it. It's not necessarily a letting go. It's a being with what is. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, and you've just highlighted another key point with ambiguous loss as well, Leanne, is that it's not dialectical, so it's not either or, right?
Yeah.
We often think of things in terms of black and white, and we think that something should be either one way or the other. With ambiguous loss, it really requires that both and thinking, right? Or being able to hold those two realities and those two possibilities in your mind at the same time. So, for instance, if you're caring for someone with Alzheimer's, then they are still there, and the relationship you have with them, whether that's, and I'm not sure what the relationship was for you, and I'm not going to ask you to disclose, right? But say it's a parent with Alzheimer's, then they are still your parents. So you are still a daughter. And at the same time, you may also be a carer, or a driver or a personal shopper, or, all of those other sorts of roles that we might take on at the same time. So we can't think in black and white when it comes to those situations where we might experience ambiguous loss. And again, Pauline Boss talks very much about that both and thinking, that both of those relationships are true at the one time. And the other good point you raised is that if we have been caring for someone for a period of time and working through or living with a sense of ambiguous loss during that time, then when the person is no longer with us, grief can often look different for us or bereavement over the person's death can be changed, because we've often done quite a bit of grieving during that time around ambiguous loss. And sometimes a person's death can also bring with it a sense of relief as well, if there's been a degree of suffering, for the person over a period of time. So sometimes people talk to me about kind of feeling like they've grieved while the person was alive, and so not kind of feeling that a sense of bereavement over the person's death. Does that kind of make sense? And again, I'm not wanting to minimise the grief around death itself, absolutely, but it's just that it's changed for the person.
And I guess in a situation like that, it's by no means giving up on, that journey that you're having with them, but throughout that journey, you have come to terms in some way with whatever is laid before you, and perhaps had your own way of dealing with it. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you've touched on another great point, that we all deal with things differently, right? So our experience of grief and bereavement is different, and our experience of ambiguous loss is different as well. Some people might be more sensitive to it than others. And again, we can't kind of label or make assumptions or second guess. If somebody doesn't experience ambiguous loss in a particular situation, it doesn't mean that they're callous, right?
Yes.
And if someone does experience ambiguous loss, it doesn't mean that they're, too sensitive either. It's just that when it comes to processing these things, we are all different. And so I think that's where self-compassion is so important, right? And maybe that sense of being perfectly imperfect that you talk about as well.
And I think humour sometimes comes into that. I was just thinking, in our family, there's been a couple of things where probably ambiguous loss has shown up, but it's shown up in such beautiful and challenging times as well, I think. And one of them is we've been talking about Alzheimer's, but also dementia. And part of my family who has been experiencing that went through a real sense of loss of what they had already planned for their future, and that was changing. But then in that time with dementia, there was also a really beautiful change of perspective from people, in that we have a different person, but yet it's the same person, but we can see different amazing qualities of that person in that ambiguous loss. And it was a lot of conversations between the family that actually supported everybody. And I think that was really a big aha moment for me in trying to work out what that ambiguous loss is.
Yeah, absolutely, Lisa. And I think that in that we can grieve for what we've lost and still celebrate what we have with the person. And I think that's, again, about that duality, right? That kind of both and thinking.
Beautiful. Well, Linda, how might we support others to manage ambiguous loss?
So I think there's a number of things that we can do to help support others. So the first one really is acknowledging that there is a sense of loss, because again, one of the key differences between grief or bereavement when someone's died and ambiguous loss is that ambiguous loss is often not acknowledged. So when someone dies, for instance, we have a whole range of, rituals and rites around that, whether we have, a funeral or we sit shiva or, we have a memorial, whatever it is, but there's a public kind of recognition of that loss. With ambiguous loss, often that's not the case, especially if perhaps we're caring for someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, for instance, then it often takes a while before we recognise ourselves as a carer, right? And some people perhaps might not ever kind of identify as being a carer. So there's no clear point at which we go, oh, I feel a sense of loss around the relationship or whatever that happens to be. And some of the things that we feel a sense of loss around can be quite intangible. So for instance, Lisa, when you were talking about your family member with dementia, sometimes there can be a loss of the desired future, right, that we had for ourselves. So we always thought we'd be grey nomads. We would work until we were 65 and then we would hitch up the caravan and we would drive around Australia. So those dreams sometimes just then don't come to fruition, right? So there's a loss of the intangible. And there can also be a loss of tangible things as well. And that might be if a person needs to give up work or to reduce their hours. So there's a loss of income, which is a more tangible loss. So I think recognising that there is a loss to start off with is certainly one thing that we can both do for ourselves and one thing that we can do to support others as well. And I think being able to name it and also then being able to normalise that this is a part of being human. And I think, again, that comes back to that shared sense of common humanity, that we do experience these things, whether it is having a loved one with dementia or separating from our partner or in a work situation where our best buddies now moved on, or we have hybrid working environments where people are working from home and we just don't get to see them and have those water cooler conversations in the same way. There can be a sense of loss with that as well. So I think acknowledging that loss is really important, and normalising the loss, that there is a rupture in the relationship and we don't have that same sense of kind of connection that we've had in the past. So I think really being able to do that for people is the first key thing, and validating the person's experience, even if it is different from your experience. Avoid downplaying the situation. Don't kind of have the expectation that people will just kind of move on, because we know that ambiguous loss can affect people in a whole range of different ways. It can impact their well-being, certainly the emotions that they feel, as well as their performance, if we think about it in a workplace context as well. And I think the other thing is that being able to build our knowledge about ambiguous loss and how to support others, I think, is really important as well. If you're in a workplace, it might look like having really good consultation around some of that change management, which we now know is a requirement in most states of Australia at the moment. Not yet in Victoria, but it's coming, around the psychosocial hazards, right? So it's, I think, being more compassionate about some of the changes that might happen within a workplace. And we also know that the things that happen for us personally impact our work, right? So I think pretty much gone are the days where we used to say, you know, leave home at the door, you know, right, when you come into the workplaces, because boundaries are so blurred now with working from home and a whole range of other things. So I think it's about acknowledging what we might be experiencing in our personal life is going to impact us in a work situation just as much as what's happening in our work context as well.
And checking in with our people. We are all human, and like I said, there's that common humanity in everything we do without oversharing, obviously.
Yeah. And taking that individualised approach, I think, is so important.
Yeah.
And you talked about compassion, Linda, and the importance of that can't be overlooked when we think about ourselves in experiencing this, but also understanding, I guess, that common humanity piece that we all suffer in some way, and that validating of it's okay to be and feel that way.
Absolutely. I think that's so important, Leanne.
I think there's some conversation about ambiguous loss is really important too, to open, you know, widely, I guess, because, you know, this is something that people possibly have been, or I would probably say have experienced without knowing what it is, and feeling a sense of sadness that perhaps if there was support systems or someone to talk to about it, and then there was that acknowledgement of what this could be, would actually make a difference to a lot of people. So I think it's a really important concept to really support others, because it seems to be that it's quite a lot, I would imagine.
Yeah, look, I would imagine so too. In the time that I've been working with people around ambiguous loss, I would say the majority of people I mention it to have never heard the term before, right? So it's the first time they've heard the term. And they'll often say to me, oh, okay, I think I know what that might mean, but I've never heard it before. Can you explain it to me? So I do. And they immediately go into, oh, so I had this situation, you know, is that ambiguous loss? And I'm like, yeah, it sounds like it. And they're like, oh my gosh, you know, the pennies just dropped. And so it can really be an aha moment for people. And that in itself can be really validating, because they might have been carrying around, you know, this kind of amorphous sense of loss or this sadness for a while and not really had the words to put to it, right? So even just having a word for it, and also knowing that, kind of being able to validate it, and also knowing that it's not your fault. Whatever the situation, there's no kind of blame or shame in this. And there's nothing clinical or pathological about it either. It's an ordinary, everyday response to a situation that could be kind of complex and painful. But it's the situation that's kind of complex and perhaps has some kind of challenges to it. It's not the person themselves. And lives are messy, right? Like, you know.
How dare they be that messy?
Linda, so we've just talked about, you know, how we might support others with ambiguous loss. But in addition to that, what can we do for ourselves when we recognise that we're experiencing this?
Good question.
Yeah, great question. So there are a few things, and I'm going to refer back to Pauline Boss's guidelines. So we've already talked about normalising ambivalence. So understanding that we might feel a whole range of emotions, and that's just part of the experience of loss. The second thing could be revising our sense of attachment. So because the relationship between ourselves and the other person has changed, the sense of attachment that we have with them might have changed as well. So we might need to look at how we can still have a relationship that's nourishing with the person, but might have different expectations. So Lisa, you spoke about your family member with dementia, and also that there was some, golden moments in that relationship as it is now that you mightn't have previously had, right, or had access to as well. It might be that we have a partner with dementia or Alzheimer's and they can no longer relate to us in a way that has that sense of emotional intimacy. Or it might be that we have a child, might be an adult child, for instance, with a substance use problem. So it could be that we look to augment the parts of the relationship that we're missing with other relationships. So we might cultivate other relationships. So for instance, if it was with a, teenager or young adult, then it might be mentoring younger people or becoming involved in, an L to P program. It doesn't, we're not trying to replace the relationship, right, with the person, but what we're trying to do is kind of augment or supplement those relationships that we have in terms of the attachments that we feel. Another guideline is around adjusting mastery. So this is recognising what we can change, so what's in our influence, and being able to let go of what is outside of our control. So in our culture, we tend to like to fix things. We're solution focused, we go into fix it mode, and sometimes we just can't fix things. So this is around having that understanding of what we can change and directing our energy and effort towards that, and finding a way to make peace with what we need to let go.
I love that, Linda. Just on a segue to that, I've just been supporting my mum and dad up in Queensland, and a very critical sort of a way. And in that time, I drew on to support my mum in particular in Shifting the Monkey. Have you ever read the book Shifting the Monkey?
No,
it's an amazing leadership book. It's only about 100 pages and I can't remember the author, but I'll put it in the show notes for you later. And in that it was as to which monkeys land on your shoulders. Do they belong to you or not? And so for Mum, she had just way too many monkeys that didn't belong to her. They belonged to other people. And I said to her, there are some things that you have no control over them. They're not yours to control. So get rid of them. Anyway, she spent a beautiful time just flicking them, and she'd just do this with her thumbs and got rid of it. And it helped her to go from feeling really sad to actually feeling a bit more positive in what she could do. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a really important discussion to have, especially that adjusting to the change.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lisa. And that's a great example. It helped bring it to life. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
The other thing we might need to look at is how we reconstruct our identity. So depending on the loss that we've experienced, if it's loss of a job, for instance, we know that that can impact our sense of self and sense of identity. So it might be around going back to our values, what's important to us, and also, again, going back to our strengths as well. What can we do in this situation to help us feel, like ourselves, and to reconstruct that sense of identity, especially if we have a partner with an illness or a acquired brain injury, whatever it happens to be, and, our identity has been sourced from our relationship, then it could have a big impact on who we now feel that we are in the context of that relationship. So I think always going back to our values and our strengths can be really important in terms of identity.
Yeah.
I'm coming to the end of the guidelines. I've just got 2 more, and these are in no particular order, right? So it's just really about kind of finding one that you think resonates with you and where you are at any point in time. So one is finding meaning, but not the meaning of life, because we know that's like a way too big to kind of talk about now. But how do we find meaning in the situation? And you would be familiar with Michael Steger's work, you know, saying that in terms of meaning, we all like to have that sense of significance. So that sense that we matter in some way. And also a sense of coherence, that there's a narrative to our life as well as a sense of purpose. So how do we find those things in the new situation? And I think sometimes I think it's easy to have this underlying sense that if we're good people, right, if we do good, if we be good, then good things are going to happen for us. But Kerry Greenwood, you might know Kerry Greenwood. She's an author. She wrote the Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, for those of you who are into Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries. In one of her latest books, she wrote a line that just really captured my attention, and that was that life is full of unjust punishments and undeserved rewards. And I think that is so true, you know. And so I think sometimes we may never find meaning or kind of the why of what has happened to us, but I think it's around, again, that sense of acceptance and being able to integrate the experience into the narrative of our life, or the story that kind of weaves through our life. And the final guideline for resilience, for living with ambiguous loss, is discovering new hope. And, you know, Dr. Lucy Hone, in her book Resilient Grieving, she talks about, you know, as human beings, we don't just have one hope, right? We have a multitude of hopes. So even when something really challenging happens for us, and maybe, you know, it means that we can't achieve our long desired hope of that grey nomad life, given the change in circumstance, what are we hoping for now? Because even though that one hope has gone, it's very likely that there will be new hopes that might come to the fore as well.
There's an element of optimism there too, Linda. If we're inclined to be a bit closed-minded to possibility, we might feel quite trapped in this feeling, in whatever it raises for us. But that hope, having new ideas of a way forward, is perhaps freeing in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely. I agree, Leanne. And I think it's about, we're not talking about toxic positivity, right? So we're not pretending that everything's good. We're not brushing, you know, the negative feelings or the challenging aspects aside, but we're still looking for those glimmers and those things that perhaps we can be grateful for in amongst what could be painful times or experiences for us.
And perhaps with the hope, it's that new pathways, like you mentioned, Leanne, you know, in hope theory, it is about finding different ways. And so perhaps, you know, whether this person who might have dementia cannot travel again, well, maybe there's a different way to travel. Or different opportunities to think about the adventures that I hoped for before, and how can it be done in a different way.
Or in the case of job loss, perhaps redundancy or something like that, feeling that sense of loss of losing work and perhaps feeling helpless. What is there for me in the future? And, you know, I guess sitting with that and understanding that, you know, we can find a way forward with this experience. But
absolutely. Yeah. And I think, again, it's about kind of, you know, taking time to sit with and feel the loss, right? And to work through it. And to look more broadly, to be creative. You know, I think it goes back to that old saying, and there's lots of versions of it. So the version I'm going to say is when one door closes, a window opens, or, you know, whatever the saying is for you. But how do we look towards the possibilities?
You can feel quite angry with the world for whatever circumstance you find yourself in. We're not disclaiming or discounting any of the challenge or tragedy, but using that as fuel to move forward, lessons learned perhaps. I know that it's not always easy, and we all have a different way of being able to meet that challenge. But there would have to be some relief in being empowered with a new way forward.
Oh, absolutely. I think as someone who was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer at 39, I could have spent a lot of time going, why me, right? Like I exercised, I ate all the right foods, but there's really no joy in that. Like I'm not going to get anywhere with that, you know? So Kerry Greenwood's quote really resonates with me as well, because and again, I think it's that acceptance, you know, life isn't fair. Life is messy, and we can't compare our lives to anyone else's, right? So it's about how do we find that sense of energy, enthusiasm for the life that we have, and kind of continue to look forward on that. And I think with ambiguous loss, you know, with grief, they often talk about waves of grief, right? Whereas Pauline Boss talks about oscillations of grief, or ambiguous loss. So it's like a fan that turns, that oscillates, right? And sometimes it will be blowing straight at you, but then other times it will be kind of turning away from you. So I think it's a realization that ambiguous loss isn't static. We're not going to feel, you know, the same way each day, right? It's going to come and go. And I think particularly chronic sorrow is a form of ambiguous loss that parents of children with disability can experience as well. And that's around that kind of chronic element of ambiguous loss, because some days or weeks, months or years, but ambiguous loss or chronic sorrow mightn't touch us. We mightn't feel its breath, right? But then other times when it comes to developmental milestones, or, you know, friends, children's are going off to school or getting their first girlfriend or driving a car and my child isn't, then at those times, ambiguous loss might be kind of closer to us. So I think it's in terms also of how we look after ourselves and support others. It's perhaps thinking about what are those times when we might feel it more acutely, and what can we do in terms of putting in some strategies to lessen the impact on us and to build our resilience around those times as well.
Linda, I'm just actually wondering, as we get towards the end of our recording with you today, and I don't want it to be the end, but do you have a book or a podcast or a TED Talk or any resource that you think might be valuable for our listeners today, particularly about ambiguous loss?
There's not a lot out there, Lisa.
You might need to do that.
I might need to do that. There are a couple of podcasts that I've managed to find. The University of Minnesota also has an online course around ambiguous loss. And one of the books that I would recommend is one of the original books called Ambiguous Loss, Learning to Live with Unresolved Grief, and that's by Dr. Pauline Boss. There is also a book on chronic sorrow. So that's called Chronic Sorrow, A Living Loss, and that's by Susan Ruse. So depending on kind of the situation, if you are a parent of, you know, a child with a disability, for instance, and you feel a sense of chronic loss, because again, not all parents of children with disability will experience ambiguous loss, but if you do, then Chronic Sorrow could be a book that I would recommend in that instance as well.
Oh, thank you for that, Linda.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Linda, one thing that we like to do is ask all of our guests what their favourite wellbeing strategy is that they practice. Do you have a wellbeing practice that's one of your favourites at the moment?
Thank you, Leanne. Yes, I do. I have many, and I will choose just one, my favourite one. And that is walking in nature. Nature has, just so many healing and nurturing qualities. So I frequently am found walking the rail trails, and I'm lucky I live in Gippsland, so I'm surrounded by beautiful nature here. So I think walking in nature, absolutely. It has the benefits of walking, getting the blood to our brain, and also the benefits in terms of cognitive restoration and healing that nature brings as well. And I think the other thing I would say too, that I haven't already, is that whilst ambiguous loss is a normal and ordinary response to situations, if you are struggling with it, then get help, right? So seek out the support that you might need. And there's a number of organisations in Australia. So there's Grief Line, for instance, that you can call. And there are also counsellors who specialise in grief and bereavement as well. There's Carer Gateway if you are caring for someone with a disability or dementia. There's Dementia Australia as well, given that we've talked about dementia and Alzheimer's a bit today. I thought I would mention them. And sometimes you might also look for specialist help as well, because depending on the nature of your ambiguous loss, there is some suggestion that grief services that focus on grief related to a death might not always be the most appropriate for ambiguous loss, because there are different features to ambiguous loss, as we've spoken about today. So perhaps reaching out to somebody who specialises in ambiguous loss, either kind of coaching or, strategies, might be worthwhile as well.
That's such a great tool for others, I think, is that, having a mentor as well, or a counsellor or a professional that's needed, and finding a person who is right for you or right fit. Yeah.
So important.
Well, finally, and I don't want to say finally, but oh my goodness, if people want to find out a little bit more from you, what's the best way that they can contact you, Linda?
They can contact me via my website. So that's all the W's, lindarowley.com.au, or they can look me up on LinkedIn, or just send me an email or give me a call. And my details are on the website.
Thank you so much. And we will be sure to share them in our show notes as well. So thank you. Thank you so much for the time that you've spent with us today, Linda. We are so grateful to have learnt so much more about ambiguous loss today.
So grateful. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, Lisa.
All right.
How good was that conversation, Leanne?
I learnt so much, Lisa. I feel I know so much more about ambiguous loss than I did this morning, that's for sure.
Oh, totally. I didn't know what ambiguous loss was at all. I had to Google it. And then obviously when Linda shared what it was, I just thought, wow, there's so many times I've experienced ambiguous loss.
Yes.
I didn't have the language to be able to, explain what that was.
Yeah.
I really loved when she talked about, once we knew what it was, really acknowledging and recognising ambiguous loss.
Yes.
And when we do that, then we understand that it is part of common humanity and life. Life is not always rosy.
No.
Wonderful sunshine every day. It's
that validation, isn't it? And I think she made a good point around, we need to steer clear of this, toxic positivity.
Yeah.
But, we can't discount the challenges
or the rocky roads, and all of that we experience. That's all part of the course, and without that experience, we don't evolve. Being empowered to create new pathways, new ways for hope and meaning, so important and makes such a difference.
And we really need both, don't we? Like, in those periods where ambiguous loss is occurring and acknowledging that is occurring, there can be some sadness involved, but there can also be the joys of things or the funny parts to it that bring a different lens. Yeah. And it's okay too. Yes. But the other thing I think what I pulled out of today's conversation too is that acceptance of this is just what it is. And we have got some hope and options and opportunities to change some of that thinking if we need be, but also acknowledging the crappy little parts there too.
Yeah.
Such a wonderful conversation.
Yeah. Okay, bye for now.
And thank you for listening to the Imperfect Us podcast. As always, we are extremely grateful to our executive producer, Brenton Ainsworth, for helping us to put this episode together. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with someone you care about, and we would be grateful if you could rate this podcast on iTunes. To continue the conversation and see what we're up to, you can connect with us on LinkedIn. Just search for Imperfect Us. Bye for now.